Well, thanks for being here. This is not a conversation that luckily happens often, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. Number one, it's tragic what happened on both sides, whether it's the family of Mr. Downing himself, and the officers in our IMPD family, and the community in general. Anytime something like this happens, it affects all of us, and so I express my deepest sympathy and to both the officers and the family, and at the same time try and give as much explanation as I can at this point. This occurred Friday. Here it is Wednesday. I think since I've been chief, I've tried to be as open as possible, and at the same time seeing the importance of the integrity of the investigation. So today what I would like to do is, for kind of a lack of a better term, is kind of set the stage, so give you kind of what led up to the incident initially, walk you through what we know and what I can about what occurred, and then talk to you a little bit about the process moving forward and where we are, which is indicative of explaining both the criminal and the administrative side of this investigation. And in order to do that, I gotta explain some things that not everybody understands, and so I know most of you here in the room get that, but many of the viewers and those people that you talk to don't understand, and so I'm gonna try and explain all of that, and then I'll take questions at the end. As you know, for the last couple years, we've developed what we call the Indianapolis Violence Reduction Partnership. We call it IVRP, where everybody that's involved in law enforcement in Marion County and actually some outside counties sit together every other Tuesday, and they talk about specific homicides, non-fatal shootings, specific people, specific behaviors that have given rise to those non-fatal shootings and homicides, and also specific places where those non-fatal shootings, homicides, and that behavior that draws that occurs. That'll be important here in a little bit to give you some understanding. We also have the Crime Gun Intelligence Center that does similar work and identifies those weapons that have been used in multiple crimes, and then allows us some intelligence around people that are involved in those non-fatal shootings, again, places and behaviors surrounding each one of those incidents. We glean a lot of intelligence from those information, and then there are people in the room that can actually take action on that. So if Brian Roach is a shooter, there may be somebody from Southwest District that knows Brian Roach that raises their hand and says, hey, we know Brian Roach, and we'll take that case. Our flex team. Every one of our districts has a flex team. These are officers that you wouldn't normally see that come to your door on a run. A lot of times they are dressed in plain clothes because they bounce back and forth from enforcement type of activities and surveillance and investigations. Each district has one. Their main focus is, I talked to you about CJIC and IVRP. They are problem solvers, but they are also that operational arm, or one of those, from IVRP and CJIC. So when you identify specific people that are involved in violence, and these are typically people that have been involved in multiple incidents of violence, and then again, those same places and those same behaviors. They're also tasked by their commanders at each one of the districts. They're problem solvers. They're complaints that come in from the community. Complaints from city county councilors, complaints from me, anything that needs to be addressed. But for the last couple of years, these flex teams have been focused on violence and those things associated with it. The East District flex team, East District has two flex teams. I think it's the middle shift flex team was working Friday. The flex team was in the 4200 block of Brentwood. They were there because of just what I explained. That's an area where we've seen quite a bit of violence. It's an area where we have complaints of narcotics activity. And so that information was both generated from places like IVRP and CJIC, also the officer's own observations, so internal, but you also have community members that have brought that to our attention. And then as recently as a couple weeks ago, people that are walking around trying to engage those that are involved in violence, community members outside of the police department, came to East District Commander and said, look, they're 4200 Brentwood, a lot of narcotics activity. So these officers were doing surveillance. There was one officer that was observing the activity in the 4200 block of Brentwood. They observed what they believed to be a narcotics transaction. During the course of that surveillance, they described a van to another flex team officer who's in a fully marked police car, wearing plain clothes, but has a outer vest carrier that identifies him as the police, along with his badge and then his gun belt. The officer sees the van, gets behind it. At this point, he is by himself. He follows it westbound on 42nd Street and stops the vehicle in about the 8500 block of East 42nd or 42nd in Richelieu. 42nd Street is a busy street. The car is pointed westbound. The officer parked his vehicle behind him, and he approaches the car. He approaches the car on the passenger side because of all the traffic on the driver's side. That's for the safety of the officer and the occupants. It's not something unusual. It's something based on that officer's training and experience, his environment, and also taking into consideration the safety of him and the occupants of the car. As he approaches, he's doing an investigation. As he approaches the car, he asks the driver for identification. The driver produces what I believe is a driver's license. He then asks the passenger, which ends up being Mr. Downing. He asks the passenger for his identification. From what we have so far, the response was, I'm from Illinois. And he gave a name and a date of birth that did not end up being his real name, Deshaun Downing. The officer goes back to the car to what normally happens. We try and confirm those people that are in the vehicle, and also understand that this is a narcotics investigation. It's still at this point. He goes back to the vehicle. At some point, the other two. The officers that I'll describe as the officers that actually engaged Mr. Downing in this shooting approached. They were also on the flex team. They pull up and they position themselves on the passenger side, and they are observing the occupants of the van while the officer, the first officer, I'll call him the witnessing officer, goes back to the car and to confirm both occupants. He's able to confirm that the driver is who he says he is. He's unable to confirm Mr. Downing. So the name that Mr. Downing gave and the date of birth we couldn't find anywhere in the system. He gets out of his vehicle. The witnessing officer, again, this is the officer that pulled them over was not the officer that actually engaged in the shooting. As he's walking back up to the car, again, a lot of this information I have, a lot of it I don't have, and so I'm telling you what I can. As he walks up to the car, at some point he talks to the officers that had engaged Mr. Downing at some point, talks to them and lets them know that Mr. Downing is unconfirmed. The name he gave them was not the correct name, and they're going to get him out of the car. At this point, from what we know, those officers are very close to the passenger side. One of the officers that ends up engaging Mr. Downing opens up the passenger side door. The statement that we have from the witnessing officer is all that we have right now. I'll explain that process later, but I think it's important that you understand it as I walk through this part. The officers who engaged Mr. Downing or fired their weapons are under two investigations. One is criminal and one is administrative. So that means they will talk about or have the opportunity to talk about what happened during the incident in a criminal investigation and also an administrative investigation. In a criminal investigation, just like all of us, they have the right to remain silent. They have their Miranda rights, and they'll discuss with their attorney whether they're going to give a statement or not. We do not have that statement as of yet. They have not provided that to our criminal investigation. On the administrative side, I am able, as a department and them as employees, they have to give a compelled statement. So they go to Internal Affairs, which is a different entity from our homicide investigations, and they give a statement. They tell what happened, and that's compelled, and it's under Garrity. What that means is anything that is said in that administrative process by those two officers cannot be used in a criminal investigation. So anything that I may know or that I later learn that those two officers say, I will not be able to repeat that until the criminal investigation is complete and the prosecutor's office has either decided to file charges or not file charges. So the only statement and the only information I have is what we picked up from the scene, and then later evidence from the scene and also other witnesses that we've interviewed. Again, I won't identify those witnesses, and I'll talk I'll give you in general sense of what we've heard from the witnesses, because there is a criminal investigation that's ongoing. You have all three officers at the passenger door now. You have one of the engaging officers opens the passenger side door. The intent is to get the occupant, Mr. Downing, out of the car. From the witnessing officer, again, the one that did not engage Mr. Downing, we get what he describes as going to the waistband and then coming out and turning. So if this is the passenger side, coming out and turning, and what the officer says is, I pushed off. None of the officers have their weapons out. He says, I pushed off so that I would not get shot in the head. The officer says he saw the gun as it came across. When he pushes off to create distance, he hears the other two officers making commands and shooting. He hears shots, doesn't know whether it came from the passenger or the officers. He just hears shooting. So that's the best information that we have from the officers, and I don't know that information will change to something that I can tell you publicly until the criminal investigation is over. But for us, for the criminal investigation and also for the administrative investigation, having that witness officer tell us what he saw and what he was able to articulate gives us an idea of what occurred that evening. At that point, there is a driver. At some point, the driver gets out of the vehicle. I don't know whether the engaging officers gave him commands, but he ends up on the ground prone. Eventually we locate two handguns. One handgun is in the vehicle and another handgun is outside on the driver's side. The autopsy is being completed. I don't have that full report, nor do the investigators have the full report. What we know based on the information that our detective gleans, who participates in the autopsy, is that those rounds that Mr. Downing was shot multiple times, and that those rounds were on his left flank. So it would have been this side, which is also corroborates what we heard from the witnessing officer. One of the things the witnessing officer also, when asked how Mr. Downing was positioned when he saw the gun or when he thought he was going to be shot, it was that the way he described it was that his back was towards the windshield, which would indicate that he had turned all the way around. I don't have enough information to tell you whether he was standing or still sitting, but he had turned all the way around in a manner to get a gun up in front of the witnessing officer's face and to make him push off. Further, the autopsy will have to wait for the report. We'll also, they always do toxicology. We will have to wait on that. From all the witnesses, from what I've been able to glean from the investigators, there is nothing, either video or testimony, that a couple things that has the whole story and that saw it all. There are people that heard things, and there are others that saw things, but nobody is able to put all those pieces together. But at the same time, we have not heard anything that would indicate that which I just told you is different. So right now, based on everything that's been brought to me and everything that I've seen, I don't have anything that would indicate that anything else happened other than what that witnessing officer said. A gun coming around and being pointed in his direction, him fearing that he was going to be shot and pushing off. We were canvassing Sunday, came across some witnesses that we didn't have Friday and Saturday. The investigators are still working on that, still putting all that together. There's still interviews to do. The officers have completed their internal affairs testimonies. So that is being put together. One of the things that we've started in the last couple years is every officer involved shooting, whether someone is hit or not, that decision that an officer makes to fire his weapon, not only is there a firearms review board, which I think most understand, but there is an executive kind of administrative review as soon after the officers give their compelled statement, as I can get both internal affairs and homicide in the room. What happens is that will occur maybe next week at the earliest. But what will happen is internal affairs and homicide will come to the room. It's my executive staff, which is my deputy chiefs and above. I also have a training commander in there. Typically, the commander of the officers involved is in there, and then someone from policy. And the homicide investigator will walk through what he has, and then because of what I explained to you earlier, that homicide investigator and anybody that has anything to do with the criminal investigation is asked to leave the room. That is so that anything that administratively we have found does not cross over into the criminal investigation. After homicide leaves the room, internal affairs then walks through what they have, which includes the officer's statements. What that allows me to do is three things. Number one, it gives me a better idea of what occurred. Number two, it gives me an idea of what I should do with those officers at this point while the investigation is ongoing. Right now, they're on administrative leave. But it also allows me very quickly to identify any concerns that we may have had on training or policy that we need to get out to the rest of our officers in some manner, so that if something was out of line, that we can impact that and make sure that the whole agency understands that. So that will occur next week. The Firearms Review Board, which is made up of the commander of the Training Academy, commander of homicide, commander of internal affairs, and then a lieutenant from the division of the officer, and then a peer of the officer. That will not sit until after we get a decision from the prosecutor's office. And then that board will review. So prosecutor's office has been involved in the investigation since the beginning. At some point, the homicide detective will have everything that he thinks he has, and he will present all that information to the prosecutor's office, and then they will have to review. I wouldn't speak for Mr. Curry, but I think he's got a couple things he could do. He could give that to the grand jury. He can make a decision himself, which I think he does from with a review of his top lawyers over there, or he could send it out to a special prosecutor. The autopsy, I think what's important is that autopsy, when it does come out, it will list death by homicide. That has no determination in a criminal case. It's just one of the categories that they have, which means someone died at the hands of another, and that's what we have here. And so a lot of times when that comes out, the public doesn't understand that a little bit, so I wanted to make that clear also. Right now, we are in waiting on the autopsy, that report. The criminal investigators are still doing some interviews. I know the two engaged officers were interviewed in internal affairs, but they still have other information that they'll continue to glean from the investigative side before they will be ready. But next week I should have an initial executive briefing and maybe have a little more information. But that doesn't mean I can share that, because that information will probably come from the statements of those officers. And I've got to protect the integrity of the case, and those statements cannot be used against them in a criminal matter.